and welcome to our webcast, Making Remote Working Secure. My name is Tim Wood. I'm a partner in KPMG's Lower Gulf firm, and I'm delighted to be your host today for this webcast. Before we kick off, a few housekeeping points. The webcast will last 45 minutes. We've got 30 minutes of content and presentations, and then we've left 15 minutes at the end to answer any of your questions. Throughout the duration of the webcast, participants will be on mute, but we do encourage you to ask questions via the panel, the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those as we can do at the end of the session. We're recording this webcast and we'll be sharing the video and the audio with you via email over the next 48 hours, and we'll also be sending you a short survey that we ask you to fill in. So let me introduce you to the team. So as I said, my name is Tim. I run the cybersecurity team in KPMG Lower Gulf, based out of the UAE. I have with me Ton, who leads the cybersecurity business in Saudi Arabia and Levant. We have Sheikh Shadab, with us as well, who leads the financial services sector for the cyber business. And then last but by no means least, we have Logan Simpson, who runs the cyber practice in KPMG Bahrain. If we can move on to the next slide. So before we start the webcast, I think it would be good just to put this in context. So Covid-19 has changed all of our lives. In a way, I think the change is unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. And there are some profound implications of the pandemic that's unfolding in front of us. First of all, if you think of the health and well-being of the global population and the stress that that's putting on the healthcare systems. Secondly, if you think about the global economy and the implications of the lockdown that have been rolled out in this region and globally, that's having on the GDP, with all nations forecasting a reduction in their GDP this year. But this webcast isn't about those two implications, but there is a third fundamental implication or profound implication of this pandemic, and that is to do with the increasing use of digital channels, primarily due to the lockdown measures. So, for example, we've seen an increase in digital banking, online retail, food delivery, and even consumption of cloud services. But probably the biggest impact for most of the people on this webcast today is that everyone is probably sat at home listening to this webcast rather than doing it from their office. And this is exactly the subject of this webcast. How can we continue to operate businesses effectively and efficiently, but also securely from home? We're going to break this question into three parts. Logan is going to kick off by talking about the emerging cyber threats. So talking about how the cyber attackers have looking to take advantage of the pandemic that's happening around us. Given this changing threat landscape, as well as the increase in home working, Shadab is then going to talk about the key risk areas that technology professionals and cybersecurity specialists should be considering, as well as some of the key controls they either should be testing or rolling out at this time. And then finally, Ton is going to take a bit of a step back and talk about how this new normal, this new way of working is changing the security function in most organizations. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Logan to talk about the threat landscape.
Thanks, Tim. So when we look at some of the threats which have come out over the last month, there's a number of COVID-19 specific threats which have emerged in the region, and that does map pretty closely with the global threats which have emerged as well. So when we look at the threat actors, the people performing the attacks, it's generally the same mixture of cyber criminals or in some cases state-sponsored attacks. And if we follow a pattern of what we've seen in the region, we've actually only seen a slight increase in the number of cyber attacks. We don't know if that will change in the future, but so far, in terms of the global number of attacks and in the region, it actually hasn't increased. However, what we have seen is a rebranding of the existing attacks to take advantage of some of the buzz and fear around COVID-19. So, for example, many businesses, as Tim mentioned, are depending more than ever on their digital channels during this period. And so this has become a more enticing target for criminal hackers. So for example, we see threats targeting businesses using denial of service against online ordering, or phishing attacks with ransomware embedded, which then shuts down their operations. Then the attackers would request some kind of payment, holding their digital business hostage until that payment is provided. Now, one of the main attack vectors, which is the usual of email or public-facing web systems, but from a phishing email standpoint, oftentimes we see impersonations of the World Health Organization or regionally the Ministries of Health, coronavirus-specific websites, the CDC. Usually there's some kind of urgent promise of breaking news or a map showing the virus spreading in their area. And while we haven't seen the number of attacks increase, but their success rate does seem to be increasing because of some of the uncertainty that people have around this. They're more susceptible and likely to maybe click a link or download an attachment, whereas they normally would think twice about it. And it's important to note that we've seen a lot of these cyber attacks actually changing their domain names much more quickly, which means some of the traditional security tools and controls around blocking known malicious domains is becoming less effective, because as soon as they block one domain, immediately they've already created a new one and sent it. So overall, we've seen attacks continue to evolve their methods and look for new ways to take advantage of the confusion and uncertainty people are experiencing around this time.
Thanks, Logan. And interestingly, I think we've seen something like over 130,000 new domains associated with COVID-19 and the coronavirus being registered over the last few months since the pandemic kicked off. So, Logan, are there any particular attacks which are that we've seen that are focusing on attacking workers from home?
Yeah, so we have seen an increase in the number of attacks on home routers and computers and home networks. We would expect to see potential larger amounts of compromise coming from home networks. This could include business email compromise, with people sometimes accessing their work or company email from the cloud, from their personal computer, or an attack compromising their home network. And then if they don't have VPN turned on, then using that to access their work computer as well. So unfortunately, sometimes work computers may be less protected at home. If friends or family members may have access to them, it's a little bit less of a controlled environment, not the normal controls people are used to. And usually the home networks have not gone through the same security hardening steps and guidelines which corporate networks have, which also makes them a much more attractive target.
Thanks, Logan. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Shadab to talk about the key risk areas and controls that we should be focusing on.
Thanks, Tim. Hope I'm audible to everyone. So in the prevailing conditions, we believe there are 10 key risk areas that an organization need to focus to ensure security of their remote working infrastructure. This includes technology, process, and people-related security controls. Today, we would like to cover them in order of their importance to the remote working conditions. Like Tim said initially, that we are all probably working from home. So today's discussion is about how do we make sure we are secure while working from home. Since technology is a key enabler to the remote working conditions, it forms first key area of focus for remote working conditions. Technology is also the most tactical part of remote working arrangements, and hence we believe organizations need to focus on its security first. Organizations need to secure its technology that supports the remote working conditions. This includes mainly 5 key technologies, such as remote access infrastructure, like we are using VPN devices, remote collaboration tools, cloud services, if you are using them, and the end user computing devices, such as personal or corporate provided mobile devices and laptops. If we go one by one to cover these 5 technologies, first one, for remote access infrastructure, key controls that organization need to cover while securing its remote access infrastructure are the secure configuration of the VPN devices to avoid exposing any vulnerabilities to the cyber attackers. And make sure you have multi-factor authentication enabled on the VPN devices. If not multi-factor, then at least 2-factor authentication. So that's the first technology control. The second technology that we are all using nowadays is the remote collaboration tools. So for a remote collaboration tool, key controls that organization need to consider vary between private tools and the public tools that you're using for your remote collaboration. Now, if your organization is using private remote collaboration tools, such as Skype, then make sure to use only thick client version of these tools and enable use of these tools only via corporate VPN. If your organization is using one of the public tools, which nowadays most widely used, such as Microsoft Teams, Zoom, WebEx, these are all cloud-enabled tools, then make sure you keep your meetings private and at least not share any of the links on the public forums, and start using a password wherever possible, such as Zoom meetings. So that's the second part of the technology that we are using. The third technology then probably most of the organization have started using is the use of cloud services, which has exponentially increased in last few weeks. And if your organization is using one of them, it's important to implement key controls covering user access and authorization controls on cloud, information protection controls on cloud, because your data is going there. So you need to make sure that the data is protected in terms of encryption and things like that. Network security control and advanced threat protection control that are widely available across all the cloud service providers such as Azure or AWS. To avoid use of shadow IT by business in this current situation, such as Dropbox, it is advisable to configure CASB controls so that you can properly configure access to any of the shadow IT usage. So that's the third part of technology. And the fourth and fifth part of the technology is the end user computing devices, which is laptops and mobile phones. Key controls that organizations need to consider includes basic security configuration of these endpoint end user computing devices, such as up-to-date antivirus protection, latest patches in them, automated online backup solutions, and implementation of baseline security configurations in these end user computing devices. So those are the technology control that forms first key area of focus for remote working conditions. Now, beyond technology, ensuring use of secure processes is the second key area of focus for remote working conditions. For organizations that have allowed high-risk transactions to run remotely, such as account services, remittances, employee payrolls, if you are enabling running of these processes remotely, then it's important to make sure that there is adequate segregation of duty and maker-checker controls are maintained even during remote working conditions. Additionally, remote supervision and fraud monitoring controls will be important to make sure that the high-risk transactions are run in a secure manner remotely. Fraud monitoring will be especially important to deter insider threats in a prolonged remote working situation. So that's the first area of focus within processes. The second area of focus within process is the heavy dependency on suppliers and vendors. Now, for processes that are heavily dependent on critical suppliers or vendors, such as managed security service provider, cloud service provider, or business process outsourcing provider, let's say you are running your payroll system through a third party. If that's the case, then it is important to make sure that the organization assess the geographical restrictions and the economic conditions of those critical suppliers. Because if their geographic location has certain restrictions which may lead to failure of your business processes, then it's critical for you to understand them. You have to also understand and evaluate their remote working capabilities. Are they being enabled in the same way like yourself in your organization to work remotely? You need to also revisit some of the contractual obligations to make sure that you have sufficient safeguards for any business failure from their side. And ultimately, do you have alternate supplier arrangements for your critical equipments? Now, we have seen situation where organization has faced problems in terms of arranging sufficient laptops for all their employees who are asked to work remotely. Now, do you have sufficient stockpile of those critical equipment and alternate arrangements with your vendor? And the final third area of process is the capability to respond to cyber attacks. Organizations need to make sure that they have adequate cyber response capabilities in place to respond to any cyber attacks. For example, capabilities in terms of testing, in terms of tested processes, team accountabilities, and trainings to respond to phishing incidents, brute force, VPN compromise, financial frauds, or customer data loss. So those are the three areas of processes that forms the second key area of focus for remote working conditions. Beyond technology and process, security and safety of our people are paramount in current conditions, and it forms third key area of focus for remote working conditions. Now, we have seen at least 30% of the workforce in most of the organizations are still working from offices to cater to the essential services to the nation. This requires organizations to heavily focus on the environmental and physical safety of the workplaces in terms of temperature monitoring at the workplaces, cleaning of work areas, and personal hygiene monitoring at the workplaces. And finally, the second area of focus within people is the awareness of staff and customers, and which is, we believe, is the paramount area of importance for organization to be able to deter to the emerging cyber threats. End users can be the weakest link in the security chain of an organization. And if they are not well aware of the evolving cyber threat landscape, organizations can fall prey to the evolving threat landscape. Hence, organizations need to send out regular communications to its staff and customers, making them aware of the evolving threat landscape and certain security tips to follow. So those are the people-related controls that form the third key area of focus for remote working conditions.
Thanks, Shadab. And obviously that's quite a few key risk areas. And obviously some of those risk areas will be more relevant to some people and some organizations than others. But do you have, I guess, any advice in terms of what should be the 2 or 3 things that people should focus on initially?
Yeah. So if I have to pull out those 3 key areas of focus for organization, then the first thing would be to run a rapid assessment on its remote working technologies. So organization need to spend some time to understand how secure are their usage of remote working technologies. That's the first area of focus, I believe, for all organizations. The second area of focus should be to then do a deep dive security assessment of the cloud services. If you are using cloud services, make sure that you are using the cloud services in a secure manner and you have sufficient controls built into the cloud platforms. And on the shadow IT side, especially, we need to look at what controls we have to make sure that if businesses are using shadow IT, then we have sufficient control over it. And the third area is the ability to respond to any cyber threat. I think it's especially important in this current situation where we have seen a lot of emerging threats. The ability to respond to those threats in terms of tested incident response plan and the accountabilities across the team is very important.
Thanks, Shadab. And particularly on that incident response point, it's actually even more difficult to do incident response when you have a lockdown, potentially not getting access to the servers and the locations that normally you would need to respond to an incident. So it does have to be very well thought through. I guess the second question I've got, Shadab, is it's all very good talking about these controls that need to be in place, but people need to run their businesses. Businesses need to run efficiently. They need to have access to their data. How do you ensure that those businesses are still running, so that they're still running, the controls are getting rolled out while the business is still operational?
Yeah, very good question. The controls that I mentioned today are useful for organizations to secure its remote working conditions, but it is understandable that organizations may have to relax few of them to make sure businesses operates without any failure, like you said, Tim. It's important for CISO in this situation to discuss all of these controls with the business decision makers and have the dialogue to understand why some of these security controls are important and where the security controls can be flexed. It's important that CISO plays the advisor role to the organization and ensure all business stakeholders understand the importance of security in the remote working condition. It's understandable that there would be challenges for the CISO, but then that's the role that CISO has to play and be the mediator between the business to understand what can be enabled and what cannot be enabled. Additionally, my suggestion is also to focus on detection-based control. So if you can't implement some controls, then you need to have sufficient monitoring capability on those controls to make sure that if there are breaches happening, you know those breaches and you can respond to those breaches.
Thanks, Shadab. So we'll move on now. So I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's going to talk about kind of medium term, I guess, the impact of this, the pandemic on the security function.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks, Tim, for your introduction. I want to discuss with you 4 topics which I find important to consider as a CISO. 4 topics which, in my professional opinion, should be further utilized in what we call the new normal. The new normal, like having to deal with the COVID-19 situation for at least another few months, which is our expectation. So you have to deal with continue to work from home, being confronted with lockdown, curfews, and social distance measures. So let me start with the first topic, cyber in the boardroom, and especially during this current pandemic, cyber in the crisis management. It is important that the CISO obtains a temporary place, or at least is able to get time on the agenda of the board. Preferably, the CISO should have a role in the crisis management organization. It is key that the CISO is able to support the board with his recommendations as the trustworthy advisor. It is significant that the CISO keeps safeguarding the critical assets of your organization, as these critical assets are representing the company's most critical or customer processes. It is common that during crisis situations, cybersecurity is not always on top of mind of the decision makers, as it is very easy due to this crisis, to provide priority to pleasing your customers or staff just by relaxing on security measures. Nevertheless, it is the task of the CISO to provide his balanced advice to prevent the decision makers and the organization from unacceptable risky situations. So in my opinion, the best what a CISO can do is to execute a specific COVID-related risk assessment and to evaluate these specific threats, to assess the associated risks related to the decisions made on those on the table for decision. And lastly, advise the board in a pragmatic and proactive way about the minimum required security measures. It is without discussion, and you all heard already from Logan, that these situations like COVID-19 are to be exploited by cyber criminals. The second topic I want to discuss is preserve your operational resilience. You can imagine that working from home could lead to certain undesired situations. For example, the access to your corporate network is terribly slow due to IT limitations. Your customers having problems doing everything online and have significant more questions than normal. Your suppliers not being able to supply you nor your clients. Or your client portals are just not built for these massive increase of concurrent use. Well, everything has to be done online. It is key that all these potential scenarios are quickly addressed and mitigated in order to preserve your operational resilience. So be proactive and support your organization with analyzing these scenarios. Execute the required business impact assessment, so involve the business in these decisions, preferably in collaboration with your business continuity team. Another area which should be assessed is the dependencies on your third parties. It is recommended to classify your tier 1 providers or vendors and to act proactively, request them to provide your organization with the assurances on how well they have implemented their security measures, how they safeguard the IT connections with your organization, and how they handle your client data. Executing these business impact and third-party risk assessments are essential to timely address these concerns to your decision makers and to recommend and enable secure workarounds or alternatives to maintain and keep your business up and running. The third topic I want to discuss is integrate cyber with fraud. As Logan already pointed out, there are potential scenarios where your organization will be confronted in a way that this could lead to losing money or business disruption. It is highly recommended that the potential fraudulent activities are jointly addressed by the CISO and your anti-fraud officer. As Shabab explained, fraud is a special aspect to be aware of. Combining and utilizing both skills and expertise can only reinforce the outcome of these business impacts. But above all, it will be a joint effort to identify, prevent, detect, or respond to fraud cases, and based on the lessons learned, to identify the root causes and to recommend timely the required mitigations. One can even consider to include your cyber emergency response team or your security operations center, so that certain malicious events are identified or analyzed from 3 different angles to ensure that fraud detection and anti-fraud measures are optimal as far as they can be. The last topic I want to discuss is the deputization of CISO tasks and responsibility. What do we imply with this statement? Well, basically, we would like to recommend that the CISO looks into delegating some of his tasks where he or she normally can oversee because he's normally in the office or has periodic meetings. However, you can imagine that working from home in crisis situations like this, there's simply too much to monitor or keep track of. So the best advice we can provide you with is select the most important departments. For instance, IT, the most relevant business departments, accounts payable, finance. And if possible, deputize these tasks to your other team members, because in my opinion, this is not really the time to do proper or execution of your regular audits. Provide them with the basic tasks like supporting with risk assessments, security awareness, or simply provide them with compliance tasks to monitor the execution of relevant procedures. So to summarize, the CISO should ensure that he has exposure to the board or CMO, support the organization to ensure its operational resilience, collaborate with fraud and CERT to assess potential fraud cases, expedite some of the CISO tasks to key persons in specific departments to divide the work and tracking. Thank you. Let's go back to you, Tim.
Thanks, Tom. You kicked off by talking about the importance of cybersecurity in the boardroom and that link between the cybersecurity professionals and leadership with the board, or perhaps the ownership of organizations. I guess, have you got any advice, kind of practical advice, in where, for example, an owner or a board doesn't want to engage with the cybersecurity leaders within an organization?
Yeah, that's a nice question, Tim. Well, first of all, I may assume, or you would assume, that the CISO already has a good relationship and governance in place to support his access to the board, either by himself or, let's say, the chief risk officer or the chief operations officer, or sometimes even the chief information officer. If that's not the case, I would recommend that building an alliance with either those people I just mentioned, so the CRO, the CEO, or the CIO, or whoever in the board has, let's say, a good understanding of cybersecurity. I think building that alliance is very important. In that case, that the board decides to overrule a CISO, which is really not unthinkable in my opinion, I recommend that the CISO is I recommend the CISO to respect the decision, you know, because you can always make sure afterwards that you assess the consequences of the decision made, and to discuss that with the person in or close to the board on how to feedback this message and the result of the decision made in potentially the next meeting. It will for sure, in my opinion, appreciate it that the CISO demonstrates his capability to adopt these decisions, but nevertheless provides his professional opinion and well-balanced recommendations for considering alternative or even additional security measures. What, in my opinion, the CISO needs to understand is that when he speaks to the board, he or she should be able to translate the technical and security related risks into, for the board, understandable business language or customer impact.
Thanks, Tom. And then finally, you talked about deputizing the CISO tasks and responsibilities, and this was all about ensuring that the Chief Information Security Officer isn't a single point of failure, particularly when you're going through crisis. Have you got any practical advice on kind of which teams can get involved in that and how to go about deputizing those roles?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine that during crises like COVID, the number of tasks and activities to monitor will be enormous. So, as we said before, the CISO needs to spend time to the board and the real decision makers. So for me, I think it's best to share and delegate this part of the burden so that he can really focus on the real key aspects of his work. You can imagine if the team or the CISO team or the security team is not that big, that he really can look into what I said already earlier, to include the IT audit team members to take part of the responsibility or perhaps even support the organization, and potentially even to focus on those security measures and assess them, which were indicated by Shiva. Or the CISO can try to identify some senior staff members in these particular departments which are important, to look for those staff members who have an affinity with security or compliance, so that they really can monitor real closely the processes, the key processes, and provide the recommendations to the CISO and management. What I do think is important, though, is that when he does do deputization of his tasks, that I would recommend him strongly to have a kind of a daily roll call with these identified staff to discuss the most urgent incidents, events, or risky topics, just to make sure that he can pick up whatever he has not heard directly, but that he can bring that up to the board whenever that is needed.
Thanks, Tom. So we've come to the end of our presentation. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So thanks to everyone who's already posted questions. If you haven't yet, please do use the drop down on the right hand side of the WebEx screen to post a question, and we'll endeavour to get through as many as we can. So the first question we have is, given the evolving threat landscape, we've spoken about a number of kind of changes in the threat landscape, as well as in the technology infrastructure that people have deployed. How should technology professionals and security professionals stay up to date? So how do you stay up to date with this changing landscape? Tom, can I ask you to pick this up?
Yeah, well, I think how to keep up with this type of situation. I think what is good is that the CISO has a good insight on what actually is being communicated already as kind of open source, but also to make sure that the board is helping the board with tracking these kind of relevant threats and risks during the crisis. I think the best way to provide this to the board is using a kind of a daily or weekly dashboard, which is very simplistic, but sophisticated enough to provide, let's say, the following information. So what are the emerging threats to COVID? We're both used external and internal resources. The trends related to COVID, for example, incidents, including fraud cases or attempt of fraud cases, and looking into the root causes and the recommendations of these. What you can also make is a kind of a risk profile for the most important departments, and using some KPIs or KRIs to see whether you can identify a trend. A simple risk matrix to identify, let's say, the initially inherent risk, identified inherent risk, and then look into what the measures are which are applied, and then see whether the managed risk is still acceptable. And a short list of the actions which are identified to make sure that we have the people to act and the due date. So, and I would like to strongly recommend to keep it on one page. So board members are people with not many time, so they really like one pages in that sense.
Thanks, Tom. We've got another question that came in, which says, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, what are some of the most recurring cyber threats worldwide in the region? So, Logan, can you respond to that question, please?
Sure, Tim. So we looked at a couple of examples earlier, but expanding on that, I guess especially in the telecom sector, it's become incredibly important that they remain secure, because there has been an increase in attacks on telecom, which as the backbone of all the different industries which are now running independent on digital. So for example, we've seen a lot of DNS and other kinds of denial of service attacks on service providers trying to take down the telecom networks. We've seen, from a healthcare standpoint, we've seen hospitals being shut down due to ransomware. We've seen COVID-19 specific information about patients and testing done on them being compromised and held as ransom, threatened to be made public unless they pay. From an education standpoint, we have seen a lot of what is called Zoom bombing, which is for any video chat service, people being able to access video without passwords and crash those meetings. And from a government standpoint, we've even seen examples of, for example, in Argentina, an official government communication channel was compromised and used to spread false information. So as we see these recurring threats develop since the pandemic started, and these attacks are even now being further matured and refined. So we do expect the risk to continue to increase, and all of the defenses which were mentioned by Shadab and Tan are going to be important for us to get into place quickly and continue to mature as well.
That's great. Thanks, Logan, for that. I've got a few more questions. Somebody is asking if the session's recorded. So yes, the session's being recorded. What will happen is you will have registered with an email address, and this content will be sent, the slides and the audio will be sent to you in video form within the next 48 hours. We have another question, which is around secure use of web conferencing. So how secure is it to use public tools such as Teams, Zoom, and WebEx with a password? Shadab, this is something that you covered quite quickly under one of your risk areas. Could you pick this up?
Sure. I hope I'm audible. So in terms of proper security of these public conferencing tools, the best control could be the end-to-end encryption. But to our knowledge, at this point in time, none of these public tools enables you to use end-to-end encryption, which means the entire tunnel between yourself and the other people is encrypted. So none of the existing public collaboration tool allows you to do that or achieve that. So then we look at the other controls that allows you to some extent secure the tools. So one of that is definitely the password that you can set on the meetings. So if you're using Zoom, then of course you must enable a strong password for your meeting and make sure that all candidates are aware of the password to log into the tool. Another thing that I would suggest in terms of security using the public tools is to come out with a policy on your on remote video conferencing. And I think that's particularly important in this current situation where everybody is working remotely, that you set certain standards for every employee in your organization to follow. And in that standard, you should be ideally highlighting employees in terms of how they should securely use the different Microsoft different remote collaboration tools. Tim.
Thanks for that, Shadab. And I think we've probably got time for one more question. So, question from Ali, which is, considering an organisation which is, it's a very good question, which is a startup, which can't invest in heavily on the infrastructure related to security, then what do you suggest is a bare minimum to have in order to ensure security? So, Shadab, I think it might be worth, I guess, highlighting if there's any particular risk areas for those that are looking for a bare minimum. What to focus on?
I think the bare minimum, from my point of view, is the security of your VPN device. So if you are a startup and you don't have the required resources to put in a lot of security controls, then I think the bare minimum is make sure that the VPN device that you're using for your employees to connect remotely is secure enough, and you have taken care of all the security. And if you're using any remote collaboration tool like Zoom, WebEx, or Microsoft Teams, look for the best option in the market, and which gives you the most security, and allow your employees to use that remote working collaboration tool.
Thanks, Shadab. We have one final question, which is relating to internal audit, which I know that Tom covered earlier. I'll pick this up. I think maybe now isn't the time for people in the internal audit teams to be completing their plan as is. But there are some internal audit teams we know who are doing advisory engagements. As part of this webcast, we're publishing, you should each get a copy of a checklist, which is quite a detailed checklist, which goes through the 10 key points or 10 risk areas that Shadab covered kind of in the middle of this presentation. And that checklist talks about the key items that you should be checking, key controls across those 10 risk areas. So that, for those who work in internal audit teams, that's a good place to start to do an advisory engagement with your businesses to try and identify those gaps to actually help secure your organizations. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. Thank you everyone for joining. And as I said, we'll be sharing content within the next 48 hours. And if you could answer the survey that we're sending through at the same time, that would be fantastic so that we can improve the next webcasts. Thank you very much, and see you all soon. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.